I think together with the colleagues from London, it's time to start for us. Welcome to everybody for our webinar on climate neutrality today. Very happy to have you all in our call. A topic I think that has gained importance and attention in the past month and years, more and more. And a topic that raises probably many questions, what we are really talking about. What is climate neutrality really? And I'm very glad that we have in our session today, first of all, Angela Wilkinson, the Secretary General of the World Energy Council. And I'm very happy that you can take your time, Angela. I know that is not that easy in these days. Thank you for joining us. And I think thank you for also inspiring us by your way forward reflections in a minute. From a global perspective, really. And I'd also welcome Professor Stefan Ulreich and Dr. Karl Schönsteiner from Siemens, two of the three authors of the main chapter on this climate neutrality issue, will guide us in a minute through the presentation, in fact. Angela, I don't know whether you want to add a few words for welcome at the very beginning. Otherwise, I would just maybe add a few words on what was
Sorry, a couple of gremlins with IT systems, as if no one suffers from that in webinars. I'm delighted to join this call. I know it builds on a very, very interesting meeting that was held in German a week ago. And I think this topic on climate neutrality is a topic that will only grow in interest because of the challenges as we exit crisis, the challenges of finding more room for manoeuvre in achieving the ambitions of kickstarting economies and achieving climate neutrality, addressing the climate change issue. So I just want to welcome everybody. I'm very excited about this topic that we're looking at, and I really do look forward to hearing the next speakers and offering some reflection. So thank you very much for the invitation, and let's begin.
Well, thank you once more, Angela, for being with us. In fact, what was the motivation for us to choose this topic? I think there's many targets around. There's the Paris Agreement talking about achieving climate neutrality by the second half of the century, somewhere in between 2050 and 2099. There's the European Commission with its Green Deal, aiming at 2050 to be climate neutral within the European Union, whatever this means. There's several countries that have formulated definitions of climate neutrality and targets for different years, most of them probably by the mid of the century. But there's also companies and other associations that have defined for themselves the wish to be carbon neutral by some day. I just think of the maybe German company Bosch, one of the first ones who want to be climate neutral already in this year. So there are many associations talking about this target. And I would love to mute everybody to avoid the echo I hear in this minute. Thank you very much. In fact, there's many associations talking about targets, and it is not perfectly clear to everyone what we are really talking about. What are the technologies? What are the solutions? Are we talking about trading mechanisms, about negative emission technologies? What's all in if we talk about climate neutrality? And we hope that at least several of these questions will be solved after this session. And with these introductory remarks, I'd like to hand over to Professor Stefan Ulreich, University of Biberach, I think, who will start guiding us into the topic. Thank you, Stefan.
Just quickly before we start, this webinar is being recorded as well.
Oh yes, thank you, Robin. And if you stay in, you automatically agree that we can record this session. Right, thanks.
Okay, I hope you can hear me rather well. Also a warm welcome from my side to you to this event. In the report, which we will present rather briefly now, we dealt with the question of the ways countries and companies are taking to become climate neutral and which technologies are available to achieve this goal. The Paris Agreement in 2015 defined the goal of climate neutrality as the following. Anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions should be globally in balance with the sinks for greenhouse gases. This should be achieved by the middle of the century. The possible paths to achieve climate neutrality are essentially given by two fixed points, the current emissions, which are shown here, and the zero emissions, which should be achieved by the middle of the century. One thing is clear, the later we start with the emissions, for instance, if we start here, the greater the effort must be made in a shorter period of time. And the greater also, in this case, the demand for technologies with negative emissions, that is, technologies that remove CO2 and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Global greenhouse gas emissions have risen continuously in recent years. An exception was the year of the financial crisis, 2008, and COVID-19 should do this for this year so as well. Initial estimates currently assume a decrease of up to 7% for 2020. However, it remains to be seen how sustainable this decline will be. At least it is not economically sustainable. The abatement costs as a result of COVID-19 were estimated at roughly $1,750 per ton of CO2, so significantly higher than the current abatement costs of existing technologies that we know to abate CO2. Globally, we are dealing with roughly 48 gigatons of emissions in total. This is measured in CO2 equivalents, that is, the effects of all greenhouse gases on the climate are converted into the effects of CO2. Per capita of the world population, this corresponds to an emissions of roughly 1.56 tons CO2 equivalent per year. For roughly 3/4 of this total emissions, the energy sector or the energy use is responsible. Sorry, this was one too fast. Of course, all uses of energy. So it's roughly the transport sector with a share of 16% globally. Heating and cooling is also a part of the energy sector. And of course, power generation with a share of 28% globally, the electricity generation shown here. Consequently, it is also clear that approaches to climate neutrality focus primarily on energy. Nevertheless, there are of course also efforts to reduce emissions in the industrial and in the agricultural sector, also in the waste sector, because I mean the missing 25% should also be made climate neutral in the end. At the global level, CO2 plays the dominant role, also responsible for roughly 3/4 of the total greenhouse gas emissions, but there are also methane and nitrogen oxides that play some role in the total balance. The current status of the NDCs are the nationally determined contributions that the countries have to deliver in order to fulfill the Paris Agreement. These NDCs show the long-term goals of the countries, and we have shown them here by the balls, by these blue balls. Sorry, my mouse is not really working at the moment. So we see currently, if we sum up all the NDCs together, the total emissions, the global emissions would be at best at the current level of the emissions that we have now today. And there's also some room for a rising trend. Unfortunately, this analysis was done by UNEP DTU. And this means that we have to, or that we can expect a rather steep path that must be taken after 2030, unless there will be substantial improvements to the current NDCs. In the graphic on the left-hand side, we see some countries that have rather low emissions, for instance, India here with 2 tons per capita. But it's foreseeable that the economic development of these countries can lead to higher per capita emissions, e.g. to the Chinese value that is roughly 10 tons per capita, or even to the US with roughly 20 tons per capita. So there's unfortunately still some room for improvement. For industrial regions as the EU with just under 9 tons per capita, Japan with around 10 tons per capita, even the US with 20 tons per capita, definitely efforts are necessary to achieve a net zero. At least the EU is on the right track here. For the US, UNEP DTU used here the rather optimistic value of the Copenhagen Accords. But this might be too optimistic. We will see in the future. How to compare the countries? The selection of countries considered is to some extent arbitrary, with almost 200 parties to the UNFCCC. That is why we tried, in addition to considering the total emissions of greenhouse gases, also to arrange the countries according to certain archetypes in order to better work out the characteristics of possible paths. The archetypes strongly emphasize typically one aspect of the energy policy triangle. For instance, we have here the Green Pioneer. For the Green Pioneer, the focus is on decarbonizing the economy, and this should primarily be achieved through sustainable energy generation. The reason for this is a strong public interest in avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. Typical measures here are sectoral coupling, capturing and storing CO2 emissions, or take care of better integration of renewable energies. Typical examples for the Green Pioneer are, for instance, Denmark and Sweden. In contrast, there is the Traditionalist. For this archetype, the primary focus is on the economic efficiency of the energy system. For example, the security of the electricity system is supported by capacity markets. Renewable energies are hardly subsidized, but compete with conventional types of energy generation. The United States is here a typical example for this, also France. The EU shows both features, that is, of a Green Pioneer and a Traditionalist, so they are placed here in the middle of this symbol, of this picture. For the energy-hungry archetype, the third case we are now considering, a reliable energy supply is particularly important to enable strong economic growth. Security of supply is often backed with fossil fuels. In addition to economic considerations, environmental aspects in the expansion of are not in the foreground. Examples for these two countries, examples for the energy hungry countries, are China and India. The energy exporter, as the fourth and last archetype, is located somewhat outside the energy policy triangle. For the energy exporter, the focus is on generating export surpluses by selling energy sources. The country's natural resources are used for this case, and in addition to classic oil or gas exporting countries, the potential will be marked much more in the future by the favorable availability of renewable energies, such as photovoltaic or wind. Examples are here Chile or Australia. And what we will do now is we consider examples for each of the archetypes in slightly more detail. For the Green Pioneer, we choose Sweden as an example. Sweden is responsible for 0.12 greenhouse gas emissions worldwide and wants to become climate neutral by 2045 at the latest. A legal basis has already been created for this. The relatively low per capita emissions in Sweden, with roughly 5.5 tons per capita, are mainly due to the generation mix with high proportions of hydropower and nuclear power. CCS-based solutions are also increasingly being considered for emissions within the EU emissions trading system. First projects are being carried out, e.g. the transport of CO2 from Sweden via pipelines to existing CO2 storage facilities in Norway, and also BECCS, that is biomass power generation combined with CCS, is a way forward, at least in Sweden. In Sweden, similar to Switzerland, also negative emissions solution technologies are seen as a necessary answer to difficult to avoid emissions from industry, for instance from cement, steel or chemistry, but also from the agricultural sector. The adopted climate laws in Sweden apply to emissions outside the EU emissions trading scheme. At least 85% of the abatement in this sector should be done within Sweden. Up to 15% can be achieved by accessing abatement projects outside of Sweden. Emissions from the transport sector in Sweden are currently viewed as a major challenge. Emissions from the building sector in Sweden are relatively low, also thanks to sectoral coupling, the use of heat pumps that is quite common in Sweden. For the Traditionalist, we choose the US as example. The United States accounts for slightly less than 15% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. On the one hand, the US is a traditionalist who attaches great importance to efficiency in energy supply. On the other hand, the federal states in the US have considerable degrees of freedom in the design of their energy policy. And it is therefore no contradiction that on the one hand, the US terminated the Paris Climate Agreement, But at the same time, some federal states and also large US cities committed themselves to the goal of climate neutrality by joining the Climate Ambition Alliance. Observers like Climate Action Tracker, for instance, expect that the emissions in the US will stagnate or increase slightly by 2030. In the recent years, the United States have also been able to reduce emissions from electricity generation and transportation by increasing the use of unconventional natural gas for this purpose. For example, the coal share of electricity generation in 2000 was 50%, but in 2018 it was below 30%. And this was due mainly to the increase of the gas share in the energy mix. A path to climate neutrality was sketched for California in a recently published study, which in addition to the increased use of biomass also addresses the sink potential by increasing natural sinks and using direct air capture as an option. California primarily aims to reduce emissions in the areas of transportation and heating and cooling by zero emission vehicle and zero emission building programs. That's the way they want to go there. CCS plays in general a very important role in the United States, especially for the improved extraction of oil or natural gas by injecting CO2. This technology is promoted through tax credits, and the example we described slightly more in the text was Petranova, where the CO2 is transported via a pipeline over 80 miles from a coal-fired power plant to the oil field. And interestingly enough, a Japanese company is also involved in this project, since Japan also intends to use CCS to achieve its climate goals, which is an interesting example for international cooperation in climate protection. For the energy-hungry country, we choose China as an example. China is responsible for over 25%, over 1/4 of the global emissions. And for this reason alone, China will play a decisive role in achieving global climate neutrality. Size matters, obviously. China has overtaken the EU with the per capita emissions in recent years. By 2030 at the latest, China wants to have reached the maximum of its greenhouse gas emissions. A more ambitious NDC is announced for this year by China, but has yet to be delivered. China provides a rather mixed picture. On the one hand, by far the largest consumer of coal worldwide. On the other hand, also the largest developer of renewable projects, and also very active abroad in both fields, be it in financing, project development, or delivery of components or turnkey solutions, both for the coal and for the renewables. The transport sector is similarly mixed. China initially promoted electromobility very strongly. After the subsidy ceased, the market for electromobility, for electric vehicles, collapsed in China. The currently valid NDC will pose major challenges for China after 2030, since a very steep path will then be necessary. China is currently initiating a program with 50 near carbon zones. These are growth areas that are used or supposed to use as an example to develop a region with low emissions. The extent to which these results will be used in the future climate policy in China is, of course, still open. For the green energy exporter, we choose Chile as an example. Chile sees the change to the climate neutral society as an opportunity to become an energy exporter. The advantage of Chile in terms of solar and wind energy should be exploited. Chile has rather low share of the global emissions, so with 0.23%, twice as much as Sweden, but still rather small. Chile announced in June 2019 it would become carbon neutral by 2050 and is now currently working on legislation to help it to achieve this goal. One component of the Chilean policy is the coal phase out by 2040, based on an agreement between the government and the 4 largest electricity suppliers. Coal power generation still plays a major role in Chile with a share of 40%. That is, it will not be possible to get out of the coal in a very short time. But in a first step, it was agreed to shut down 20% of the coal-fired power plant capacities by 2024. This will be compensated by the increased expansion of the renewable electricity generation with a strong focus on solar and on wind energy. Prospectively, Chile wants to become the Saudi Arabia of clean energy, as the Chilean Minister of Environment put it in 2019. That is, the export opportunities for renewable hydrogen, for instance, are definitely seen. And this was also pointed out in a recent study by the World Energy Council Germany, which was called International Aspects of the Power-to-X Roadmap. Chile also wants to make greater use of electromobility in the transport sector. That is, by 2050, 40% of the private vehicle fleet and 100% of the local public transport should become electric. And at the same time, Chile is also trying to strengthen the natural sinks in the country. That is, at the end of last year, Chile signed an agreement with the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility to increase the forest absorption capacity. And the last example, which is not one of the archetypes, is Bhutan. Bhutan is often mentioned as the first example of a climate-neutral country, which might perhaps be easier to achieve in this case. Bhutan has about as many inhabitants as Frankfurt am Main, with this roughly 700,000. The area that they have is 10% of Germany, so much more area than Frankfurt, for instance, takes. And the forest decree is forested by 70%. For instance, Germany is forested by 30%. Bhutan lives to a large extent from the exported hydropower to India, and there are also some more hydropower plants planned in Bhutan. And they also have a very limited tourism. That is, tourists have to pay at least $200 per day for accommodation and tourist guides. There's no mass tourism in Bhutan. And under these kind of happy framework or lucky framework conditions, climate neutrality seems to be rather easy to achieve. But the big challenge is, of course, to solve the problem for bigger countries and for industrialized countries. And how companies will react to this is now explained by Karl Schönsteiner. So I hand over.
Thanks, Stefan. So we have now seen how countries are becoming greener. So what's now about companies? And first of all, the question is, what does greener mean in the definition of companies? So for one company, it's about having more renewables to supply for power. For the other one, it's about less GHG emissions or a higher efficiency. And of course, having less pollution of air, but also of water or probably of soil. And finally, companies are also signing up and committing for support for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So how do companies become greener and why do they want to become greener? That's a question. So the first answer is there are companies who are actively pursuing of becoming greener because of an economic advantage. Green is in this regard kind of only a byproduct, but it's motivated by simple economic facts. For example, fuel switch in the USA, or increasing the efficiency saving fuel, or probably as well, if you have the possibility to combine heat and power, that you might also realize some cost savings. The other companies are more driven by regulation. Take, for example, countries with have high standards for environmental regulation. Where greener is often a consequence for companies. So, for example, take the fossil fuel ban in California. Certain subsidies for renewables where they can make a business model out, or simply filter or something to reduce air pollution. Also, this could help companies becoming greener, but green in this essence is a consequence of the regulation we are seeing in many countries. And finally, there are proactive companies which are pursuing a green profile and want to market green products in order to have a competitive advantage versus other companies. And these companies are taking measures like signing up for climate targets in the RE100 or in the Science-Based Target Initiatives. These companies are also looking into carbon price or
new Green Deal. So quite interesting times.
Could we ask the one who is still unmuted to mute himself that we can better understand?
me say a couple of words about what we have.
That's the camera, I think. Okay, thanks. So, and basically, the internal carbon price or simply purchasing renewable power. So the measures are different. So let's have a closer look into the different frameworks which we are seeing. Stefan, if you might switch to the next slide. So we have the framework of the RE100 companies, where companies are pursuing to have 100% of the power from renewables in the shortest possible time frame, but latest by 2050. And over 200 companies are in these initiatives. Then there are the EP100, and these companies in this initiative try to increase the energy productivity. One target is doubling the energy productivity within 25 years. Another one is implementing an energy management system. And the third one is being able to supply for net zero carbon buildings. And over 80 companies signed up to these initiatives. And finally, there is the science-based target initiatives. And this initiative is probably the one which has the strictest climate impact in the end, because in these initiatives, companies which signed up committed to reduce the limit of global warming below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, even pursuing 1.5 degree. And so they really have a very strict emission limits, and over 300 companies already have a validated climate target in this initiative, and over 500 companies are currently in process of signing up for this initiative. So these initiatives are getting a lot of momentum. However, it's not easy for any company to get into this, to change the business and reduce emissions accordingly. And here is just a number of a few measures which are taken in order to reduce emissions. So the first one is changing the business model. For example, Ørsted, a Danish company, is selling its oil and gas business and exiting coal, and by this they reduce their energy intensity of power generation by 96% in 2023. And in the same take, they are one of the largest developers for offshore wind, as you might know. Then there are countries changing the generation structure. RWE is such an example, and RWE reduced their emissions from power production in the last, I think it's 7 years, from 2012, by over 50%. And they are going further and target climate neutrality of power generation by 2040 by expanding renewables, by going into storage, into carbon-free fuels, and exiting coal gradually. Then there is the option of increasing efficiency. And one example for this is the Hilton Group, which reduced its energy intensity by 20% and therefore its carbon emissions by 30%, saving costs of about $1 billion in the time frame of 2000 to 2018. The fourth option is purchasing power from renewable energy sources, and especially the big five, and here namely Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft are purchasing power in power purchasing agreements from wind and solar in order to secure a sustainable power supply for their operations. And we have, of course, also the option of companies which are reducing the suppliers. And this one is quite interesting because you do not have the impact only in one country, but you have it on the global supply chain. And Apple or VW are introducing sustainability audits and reviews in order to monitor the compliance with environmental standards. And this, of course, reduces carbon not only within the company, but in the whole supply chain of these companies. It has really a global impact, therefore, as well. And one, might even say frontrunner, is if companies go for negative emissions. And here we have the example of Microsoft, which from 2030 on will be carbon negative, and they are going to the point that they want to reduce its historic carbon footprint until 2050 to zero. So they want to erase this carbon footprint, so to say, from which they caused by the operations in prior years. So companies are setting very, very aggressive targets partly, and each company is different. Now let's have a look at the technological options which might be chosen for this. And at this point, I will
Okay. Thanks very much, Karl, for giving the introduction. And now we have understood what's happening on the countryside, what's happening on the company side. Now the big question is, how do we reach the carbon neutrality and by the mid of the century from a technological point of view? And if you look at the alternatives and the options we have, the first and utmost is quite obvious. It's energy efficiency. We have done that over the past decades, made pretty some progress, but it comes to a kind of saturation right now. And instead of energy efficiency, the new KPI is eventually carbon intensity. So that is a kind of change. And it comes along with a switching of fuels. Most prominent is from coal to gas, but even further to more climate neutral fuels. It's for sure also the integration of renewables, intermittent renewables. Also, there's no doubt about that this has brought a great progress, and I will come back to this later, because that eventually opens up the energy system of the future with leveraging the renewable energy from the power sector and other sectors. So next topic is all about carbon capture and storage, but also carbon capture and utilization. And also this is coming back to the agenda of a number of policymakers right now, after it has had a pretty negligible role in most of the countries so far. But if we want to significantly and vastly decarbonize, this technology needs to come back to deployment. It's all about changes in behaviors, and even if we apply all these levers which we have discussed here, it is not sufficient to reach the carbon neutrality. We would also on top need negative emissions. So that is one of the lessons learned. And if you look to scenarios beyond the power sector, this is exactly one learning. Now, I mentioned the integration of renewables, and we have made pretty good progress in integrating PV and wind into the power sector. Costs have gone down significantly over the past years. Now the electricity sector is responsible for roughly 40% of the energy-related emissions. 60%, however, are with other sectors like industry, transport, buildings. A lot is about heating. And these sectors are much more difficult to decarbonize. Now, the idea of sector coupling is nothing else than taking the renewable energy from the power sector and bring it to other sectors, and by this decarbonize these sectors. One idea here, and one tool basically, and let's go to the next slide. One tool to implement that is to go via the pathway of hydrogen. If you look at the options, there's an option that you electrify directly, that you use combined heat and power, which also has been used since decades. So these are all means to bring energy from the power sector to other sectors. But hydrogen would be of a universal use. And it's a good point of time to talk about this. The EU just yesterday has announced their hydrogen strategy. So this is something what numerous countries are now taking up as a means to couple sectors. Namely, it's EU in general. For European Union, it's Germany, but also China has put that into there, or is going to put that into the next 5-year plan as a vital element energy transition. So the idea is eventually to convert green electricity into hydrogen via electrolysis. You take the hydrogen and use it, for example, for heating or cooling, or you convert it into carbon neutral fuels by synthesis with carbon dioxide. Also, this would be a carbon dioxide sink. Eventually to use it, and it would create an alternative to e-mobility only. So it's more complementary than replacing one or the other. Or you can use it for ammonia, or even on a long-term perspective, even re-electrify using the hydrogen as an energy carrier. So there are many options which you can take, but hydrogen would be one key technology ready for implementation, ready for deployment as of now. Still having to go some way in the technology maturity ramp up. Now, if you go for next slide, please, then this is one important step. Now, I mentioned the topic of negative emissions, and the negative emissions are required on top. And there are very obvious or very simple things in principle, like a reforestation, which eventually could help to capture the CO2 during the growth phase of trees and plants. Could be also to capture the CO2 emissions from a biomass power plant, or use it for biochar. I mean, you see the potentials are quite different from technology to technology option. Definitely, there's one area beyond the carbon capture of flue gas, or within flue gas, from flue gas, would be direct air capture. Meaning you take the carbon dioxide, which is roughly 450 ppm in the atmosphere, and filter it with adsorption processes and amino acid salts. You get it out of the air. It's about soil carbon sequestration, so bringing that stuff below surface. And then there are some really fancy stuff looking into the oceans and see if the oceans can bind and extract more of the CO2, also with adverse effects eventually on the ecosystems. But these is just showing a number of levers which we have to deploy there. So that's all about the technology levers. And I would hand it over now to Stefan to come back to the conclusions.
Yeah, many thanks, Karl and Volkmar. Yeah, what are the conclusions that we draw from this report? Achieving climate neutrality within the framework of the Paris Agreement is a marathon and not a sprint. It's really a long run, hence continuous work to achieve this goal by 2050 is needed. There are not much things like a quick win, but it should also be clear to everyone that things that you don't deliver today, you have to deliver double of it tomorrow. So some continuous work on this is really needed. Each country, every region has different prerequisites, be it the potential for renewable energy, the existing energy infrastructure, technology acceptance, potential for carbon sinks, etc., etc. Therefore, there will be very different ways for each country, for each region. Nevertheless, there's generally the opportunity to learn from one another and to exchange experiences, especially in technologies that are used to a large extent globally, for instance, renewable, CCUS, or hydrogen. The technologies for achieving climate neutrality already exist. Some of them might need more research and pilot projects to understand them better. Hence, you just have to decide on the set of solutions, renewables, sector coupling, hydrogen mobility, and so on, and then implement them, provided social acceptance is given. However, social acceptance can only be reached if not only the goals of climate neutrality are broadly accepted, but also the needed measures. Politicians are particularly challenged here, who on the one hand must really deeply anchor the climate neutrality as a goal in society, But at the same time, they must also convey the need for related projects and infrastructure measures. Otherwise, the path towards climate neutrality will fail in reality. A recent survey came to the following conclusion. People see climate change as immediate and urgent, and they are concerned that NET technologies won't be ready in time to address it. But they also don't see them as fitting with their long-term vision of a sustainable future society. Deploying negative emission technologies at scale without a major effort to reduce emissions in the first place might turn out to be a red line for publics. This is a challenge, since the broad public is rather convinced that turning to renewable generation will solve everything, neglecting that 25% of the global greenhouse gas emissions are due to non-energy uses, e.g. in the agricultural or in the waste sector. Ultimately, however, the current COVID-19 crisis can also be used as an opportunity for climate neutral investments. The energy sector could become a stabilizing anchor for the whole economy due to further investments with a strong focus on climate neutrality. This was e.g. highlighted recently by several organizations, for instance, the IEA. That's all from our side. Many thanks to have the patience to listen to us for such a long time. And now I will hand back to Carsten.
Thank you very much, Stefan, Karl, and Volkmar, for your excellent presentation. Now, Angela, does that appear to you as science fiction, or what is the global view forward on all of these thoughts on climate neutrality, really?
Well, first of all, let me just recap some of the things I heard, which was that climate neutrality is part of global energy transition. Let's remember that the global energy transition agenda is not just all about carbon or about climate change or about energy. It's also about the ability for societies to continue to evolve and flourish. And part of global energy transition is about enabling more energy, not less energy, right? So we have that. So it's part of global energy transition. There's no one size fits all. I heard that. Different countries, different companies doing different things, just testing myself out here. And there are different technology levers. And I was interested in the hierarchy that seemed to be implied there, which we have to be careful with, because that hierarchy works well when you have a lot of energy, but there are billions of people across the world who don't have enough energy and would have to have a different hierarchy there. So, and I think the challenge as I see it is this climate neutrality, these pathways to climate neutrality offer, as I said at the beginning, more room for manoeuvre. I often think that the challenge of global energy transition is seen as a race along a single track road towards getting emissions down. And you've said very clearly that this isn't just about reducing emissions, right? But actually the real climate change challenge is not just running down that road, it's also manoeuvring a 50-point turn with about 1,000 hands on the steering wheel, with different needs and interests all wanting to play their part. And I think that I heard a lot about technology, I heard a lot about countries and companies, and then just at the end you threw a little bit in around social acceptability, which is always what gets me going, right? As everybody knows, at the World Energy Council we are focusing on humanizing energy transition. And when I come to this challenge, this area in particular, I can't help immediately but say negative emissions technology is a branding disaster. If you want to call yourself negative anything compared with renewable something, you're not. The social communications challenge is already on a back foot. So that's just a little playful reflection around a catastrophic branding failure, I think, about that solution space for the way societies can engage with it. Now of course, it was often, sometimes I come across people who think that global energy transition is just relatively straightforward. It's just a question of companies or countries standing in the way. But the challenge is global energy transition isn't just about technologies. It's also about changes in behavior, changes in lifestyles, changes in social norms. And we've just come through the biggest human crisis in memorable living memory, which is the global health crisis. And yesterday, when the Commission outlined its repair and prepare exit strategy, they did refer to hydrogen. They also referred to the need for not just immediately only green hydrogen, as we would call it, but also some interim areas, and also raised, I think, touched upon the area of carbon capture and utilisation. So for me, that is a very different, a broader strategy than I was seeing when I was last in Berlin, when there seemed to be an incredibly narrowing of the space around what could be used for achieving the Green Deal in Europe. So I'm not sure if that's related to the COVID crisis and the new financial realities, or if it's just that over time people are learning that there are different options that are available that not only achieve reductions in that achieve climate neutrality in a way that delivers not just against the challenge of climate, but also against the need for jobs, for affordability, for access, and for resilience. And as we deliver climate neutrality coming out of this crisis, we're also going to have to think about the energy, health, cyber nexus of resilience. And I think it might also, that's the health crisis has happened. Surveys around the world tell us that digitalization is increasing in its pace across the energy system. And we also have this challenge of resilience coming at us. So I think when we look at this initiative, it started before the crisis, and it's definitely giving us new pathways for exiting from crisis, but there will also be new challenges around cooperation, integration, and what I would call humanization of those climate neutrality pathways. And I think what will pop out most for the Commission, I'm guessing, but differently in different regions, is this hydrogen hot cake that's going on around the world. There's a huge interest in hydrogen, and I think you've looked at. I think this study looks very well at what companies are doing and what countries are doing, and I think moving forward we have to start thinking about what regions will be doing, not just companies and countries, but regions. And at the World Energy Council, with the German member committee, we've already started looking at what are the different configurations of region that might also be looking at the different pathways around climate neutrality and hydrogen. So we've had Latin America and Europe. We might have North Africa and Europe. And it's interesting that these are not traditional geographies. We're seeing different countries coming into the climate neutrality play with these different pathways around carbon capture, negative emissions technologies, and hydrogen. And so we're going to see different regional geographies, much more agile, I think, coming forward. And that's something perhaps at a later to start looking at, not just in terms of national, but also regional strategies. So I think I just want to say a big thank you on behalf of humanity, because too often I end up having to join a conversation where I'm the one who has to say there is really a difference between climate neutrality and the war on carbon. And it's and we have to really avoid that war on carbon, because the war on carbon gives humanity very few degrees of movement, whereas climate neutrality is opening up the solution space and providing more degrees of opportunity for finding fair, sustainable, resilient energy transition solutions. So those are my reflections on what has been, for me, a very interesting overview of the opportunity space of climate neutrality.
Thank you very much for widening the scope economically, geographically, also by the public acceptance dimension, which was in fact a little bit missing maybe, and is worth looking at more closely. If I may, just one question before we open the floor to all the participants, talking about this sort of political logic of climate neutrality. I came across several times talking to NGOs and other players. My feeling is that there are mixed feelings around the climate neutrality issues. Some, especially when it comes to negative emission technologies, forget about the negative brand, but it's set for some experts at least. Some say this is just a good excuse to avoid immediate action. It's prolonging the difficulties of avoiding emissions. So if we have technologies for the second half of the century, we can do as we want today and then solve the problems later with these negative emission technologies. A good excuse. On the other hand side, it might be the only way to keep the very ambitious climate policy targets to be somehow achievable. So maybe it avoids a debate about what is a reasonable target that we can set. And between two poles, there's this climate neutrality issue also in the NGO community being discussed quite controversially. I don't know what is your view from a political logic point of view. Is that helpful or is that somehow difficult in the communication space?
That's to me. So I'm just switching my. I think too often when we're talking about the global climate change challenge, which is a big challenge facing all of humanity, we forget the other part of that, and that is we're expecting a doubling in energy demand by 2050, and we've got to create more room for manoeuvre. We can't just go racing down the road towards getting climate neutrality based on lowering emissions or saving energy or cutting like that, because there are billions of people who need more energy. And the COVID crisis, I think, has demonstrated the great unevenness, even as we go towards the great awakening, as it's called, on climate conscientiousness, that actually digital unevenness is great, energy access unevenness is great, health access is uneven and great. And I think the politics will be reframed by that unevenness conversation. And I think you see it coming up through different energy agendas. We talk about it in the World Energy Council as the rise of the social energy agenda. And we see it differently in different regions, but it's not just about climate change. It's always about climate change and human development. And human development requires more energy and less carbon. And I think climate neutrality provides an opportunity politically. If you want to get elected, in some countries you have to bring energy to the table, more of it, as you try and find ways of not ruining your environment as well.
Great. Now I'd ask you to raise your hand, at least virtually or by a picture or your camera, signaling that you have questions, comments to what you have heard. And I just look on the list whether there's already a first question. I can't see it so far. If there's none for the second, then I would jump in for a second question myself and ask you maybe to think of one. Maybe to come back to your point on regions, companies and countries, and that's also a question for the three authors. Maybe we've heard the whole world doesn't look like Bhutan or Suriname or maybe Finland one day that have a good chance to get climate neutral or even climate negative, so to speak. This works very well with a few countries. It works even better maybe for companies, especially if you include offsets or the possibility to reduce emissions elsewhere and finance that out of your company. But that doesn't work maybe that well for regions. At least it doesn't work for the globe, as we don't have a second planet to cooperate. The role of offsets in this game on the different regional levels, company, nation, region. Maybe a question to, I don't know, one of the authors who I'd like to answer. Who wants to jump in?
Yeah, I can try to jump in. Yeah, perhaps first to pick up this branding topic. So it might be better to speak about carbon dioxide removal technologies in the future, CDR. I think this might be a better brand, perhaps. It sounds more positive. I think definitely, I mean, each of the regions has to look for the benefits it has in order to cope with the problem. So if you are in a good shape and have really good wind opportunities and PV opportunities, you should make the best use of it, all of it. And perhaps, I mean, this would be then the opportunity for Australia or for Chile in order to export these energies. So there's also some kind of opportunity to cooperate on this. And I'm not so skeptic that this is not already working. I mean, when I look at Australia, for instance, Australia is already exporting renewable hydrogen to Japan, for instance, because Japan is quite interested in this hydrogen as one way to decarbonize their industry emissions. I look at some other examples, for instance, I mean, the Swedish example, the Norwegian example we mentioned, because in Norway they have quite good interest or quite good opportunities to store the CO2. So Sweden can deliver the CO2 to this area. And I think perhaps it's also good to look at the regions in the US, because they have a quite independent program in the US, independent of the federal policy. And California, for instance, is typically the front runner who is really setting the tone for the rest of the country when it comes to some kind of climate topics. And also with regards to carbon sinks, I think these forest programs, especially for Latin America, this could be a really interesting opportunity to say we are using the forests in Latin America as a carbon sink. And of course, they need some kind of financial compensation for this by the countries who want to benefit from it. So I think with a mechanism like a global trading scheme, not with all the countries, but with a few countries, of course, with this kind of global trading scheme, the benefits could be reaped for all the regions and for all the countries in the best way.
And there have been attempts, especially in Latin America, to make this really accountable. For some years that worked quite well, and with political changes, trust might move, and then things are a bit more difficult. But in the end, you're right. Article 6 of UNFCCC is, of course, a prerequisite for most of these instruments. And again, a brief look into the list of the hands that I don't see so far. I can't really understand why, because after these excellent presentations, I guess there are hundreds of questions I would expect. Or even comments, maybe, if you see things different. Who dares to kick in?
Or perhaps a question from my side to Angela, if you don't mind. I mean, you said humanizing energy is one of the key topics of the World Energy Council, which I think is really an interesting approach because it really puts the energy customers in the middle of the whole discussion. How do you think can these CDR technologies, carbon dioxide removal technologies, be explained to the public that they will accept it in the order? I mean, it's always difficult because in the end you would need to develop some kind of last resort technology that should be available in 2049, because then you find out, okay, we will not meet the 2050 targets, but develop something in 2049 that will work in 2050 is quite difficult to achieve. So we need some constant work on this, how to explain it to the public.
I think partly there is, first of all, very little engagement of publics in the conversation. Yeah. So there's a lot of hypothesizing about what publics think, and there's a lot of political gaming that uses what publics think. At the end of the day, what we see in energy transition is decentralization. We see the role of communities and cities growing. We see other political actors, not just governments and large businesses, but many different scales of business, regions and non-state actors who are getting involved in the energy transition discourse. So I think actually we find a little bit more out about what publics do think or don't think, rather than just, you know, some of the polls are very narrow and they're incredibly manipulative in the way they present some of their results. And I think there's a sheer lack of energy literacy, which is really difficult. You know, I encounter many conversations where the conversation flips between we're going to have 100% renewables by 2050 in the world, and then I say, well, what do you mean? What do we mean by 100% renewables? Do we mean 100% renewables in the power sector or across the whole energy system? And then somebody goes, what do you mean by that? And I go, well, 20% of our energy system currently is electrified, 80% of it is non-electrified. And if we work very, very hard, we think we might be able to get to half of it electrified by 2050. But for that, we're really going to have, renewables will have to have friends. They'll have to have hydrogen. They'll have to have climate neutrality, even to get to that. But that still leaves 50% of the system, which is a bigger system, that can't be electrified. So we're still going to need other options. Now, if you ask people, or you know, the public, what they're talking about in energy transition, this is hard to understand. I call this the elephant and the mosquito conversation. I think we can understand that, right? I also think that there's been this terrible feed of a narrative that energy is bad, that the only way forward is to have green or renewables. And I think the costs of that and who shoulders those costs and whether they're fairly shared is not discussed very well. So there are many situations where it's always easy to say no to something. The easiest thing in the world is to say no to something. But to take some of these other solutions forward, they are cheaper, they are fairer, and they are technically feasible. And I can't see why a more reasonable debate, a better quality discussion wouldn't take those forward. But what we have to do is stop talking on behalf of those impacted and affected by energy transition. We have to let them come to the table and make some decision, be involved in some of the decision making.
Right. Maybe a question as well to Angela, but also to the colleagues from the global company Siemens with its global view on the context of climate neutrality and COVID that has been made by Angela in her introductory remarks. I just wonder to what extent the change in priorities that we see in different countries differently, of course, might affect our debate on climate neutrality. We see that private investment, for instance, for the at least next 2 or 3 years, might be a lot smaller than we would have expected otherwise. On the other hand side, public investment will jump in to some extent, following a different logic, a more political logic, obviously. And equalizing these two things out, does that help climate neutrality in total? Is that a net positive, a net negative? How does that look in different continents? What's your view, Karl, Volkmar, but also Angela, with your global view on the different countries? Where do we stand in COVID?
Well, I mean, if you look at the current situation, I believe that is nothing what you can extrapolate now to 2050. But I believe what we see is that priority is now being given on coping with climate issues. So that is definitely a first step. And we need to understand that if we talk about climate neutrality, this is the end of the journey. It's not the beginning of the journey. So that is the first step now. And I believe we need, over the journey, to grasp those technologies which are mature, available, and deployable at that given point of time. Right now, it's all about sector coupling. And the tool is electrolysis or is hydrogen. So that is something to take up now. And over the course of the journey, we will need to deploy even further measures. And I'm quite confident that by then things will have been developed. Now, with the topic of hydrogen, I mean, that's in terms of public acceptance, it's a more easy one. Yeah, I mean the result of burning hydrogen is water, and pure water even. Yeah, so that is something where eventually arguments on competition with other technologies or cost, etc., come in. But if it comes back then to carbon capture, I mean, that will induce another discussion on what to do with the captured carbon in the end. So that is something where we need to find answers, maybe answers beyond just saying, well, we store it in an aquifer, but eventually utilize it for other valuable purposes. So that's eventually a way to look forward. I'm not so much concerned that the journey gets stuck. I believe we need to start with something, and we have a great opportunity now to start with the hydrogen stuff. And then during the journey, we will see what topics to take up, what technologies to deploy at that given point of time.
Angela, with your COVID survey expertise, what's your view on it?
Well, I would go to our scenarios on COVID for that. We've been looking at, based on the surveys and the conversations with members across 100 countries, what's the outlook? What's going to really shape the outlook? And we came out with a set of scenarios that basically have 3 sets of critical uncertainties. It's a human health crisis, and these are all human-centric uncertainties. They're trust, ambition, and control, right? Not price, not money, not technology, but trust, ambition, and control. And the 4 scenarios we're dealing with are called pause, re-record, rewind, and fast forward. And if you go onto the website, you can look at where the signals from around the world are, the balance of signals for each of those scenarios. We're currently live tracking across the world. Now, exit from I think the Commission has been very fast in reformulating its new Green Deal strategy in the context of having to think about fiscal stimulus at the same time as climate, in terms of green progress. And if I look at their agenda, I mean, it's a massive agenda. It has things like reskilling and justice and hydrogen and I'm looking at the other pieces. I have them on a paper. But if I look at that agenda, it's going to require not just, as we exit from crisis, I think people are going to have to use scenarios to stress test their exit strategies, because whatever strategies Europe takes, it's still going to be emerging into a world which is also taking actions. You never get out of the global context for energy. But the other piece is around policies. We've mentioned sector coupling is the place to start, right? I spent 4 years working with Angel Gurria at the OECD in Paris, and I can tell you, integrated policy pathfinding is really, really difficult, right? You have to have people coherence in ministries before you can have policy coherence, and that requires a different approach to policy. So there's a whole policy innovation piece here, which is around, again, people. So I think even to get sector coupling going, you have to bring together different sectors. You bring together different sectors, you've got to bring different ministries, you have more diverse interests, you've got to have different tools and better ways of finding sufficient consensus. You'll never find total consensus. And so we're going to have to exit from crisis with a new approach to cooperation. We're going to have to exit from crisis with a broader set of solutions that are more affordable to many different types of society at very different stages of development. And we're going to have to exit from crisis with regional cooperation that helps save global cooperation.
Well, thank you, Angela. That sounds already like a final conclusion to our session, because once more coherence and more cooperation is asked for, platform like the World Energy Council comes into play to really foster this further cooperation and understanding. And I hope at least that our session today might have helped a little bit, coming a little step forward in these terms. I might add that the English version of this chapter on climate neutrality should be on our website and maybe also in the chat. I didn't look at it already. We will record or publish the recording of this session as well. So whoever might have missed a piece might have the chance to read or listen to it later on. Thank you very much, all the contributors, the authors, Angela, for an interesting session, and well, have a good evening, good afternoon, evening, wherever you stand. Bye-bye, and thank you.
Thank
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Carsten. Bye.